Is President Biden really willing to risk American lives in Eastern Europe? We'll discuss this and more with Guy Taylor from the Washington Times. Guy, thanks again for joining us. Can you just bring us up to speed here on what's going on with the crisis in Ukraine?
Hi, Peter. Thanks, as always, for having me. We are definitely at a moment of geopolitical brinkmanship between the government of Russian President Vladimir Putin and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the United States. The Biden administration really in a foreign policy struggle right now over whether or not to stand up for the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine, which is a fledgling democracy right on the edge of Russia, the biggest of the former Soviet republics in its own right, a sort of medium-sized power in the world. And the Russian government has been massing troops on the Ukrainian border for the past several months, really more and more threatening to possibly go in and invade Ukraine and try and absorb at least half of the country back into Russia. And the question here is whether or not the United States sort of stands with the Cold War era, sort of Ronald Reagan era policy of peace through strength. Should the U.S. stand up and try and prevent Russia from invading Ukraine or not? And it's playing out day by day, where we're really not sure whether the Russians are going to go into Ukraine or not at this point.
Mm-hmm. Now, standing up to them, what does that exactly mean? I know we've talked about sending, arms shipments over to Ukraine. Does it mean putting American soldiers at risk in Ukraine?
It's a really good question. So far, the Biden administration has said, has been somewhat vague, saying that if the Russians go into Ukraine, that the consequences will be massive and horrible for Russia. But the Biden administration has not explicitly said what those consequences will be. The administration officials have hinted at the idea of sanctions or economic isolation from Moscow. And that would require the United States working with really its European allies, the biggest markets for Russian goods, Russian gas, for instance, that gets pumped into EU countries and heats homes across Europe, Western Europe in the wintertime. Could those countries stand together and uphold a sanctions regime that punished Russia if Russia goes in and takes part of Ukraine? And also, what kind of carnage and chaos could unfold here? Your question of, is the United States willing to send troops in? Right now, NATO and the U.S. has a few thousand troops in Poland, and NATO countries have a few thousand troops peppered around the Baltic states. But there aren't any NATO troops in any of the former Soviet republics. And this is something that the Putin government is very eager to prevent from happening. A lot of this crisis is the Russian government saying, why has the United States and its sort of group of democracies in the post-Cold War era, the last 30 odd years, why have they pushed this military alliance right up to the borders of Russia? And the US and NATO argument is that, in fact, the United States and the European Union have not been pushing to try and encroach democracy on Russia. In fact, the countries that are the former Soviet republics have reached out to Western Europe to say, could you help us set up a security blanket just in case the Russians try and invade us? So it's a kind of complex dynamic playing out right now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any truth to some of the criticisms, particularly from Republicans, saying that President Biden's posturing here is really just an effort to distract from all the, all the problems happening domestically in the United States, for the economy, inflation, things like the southern border? Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think it's another good question. Okay, I'm going to say that it's certainly true there are people making this criticism that this is what would be called like a wag the dog situation, mm-hmm. which is the idea that the White House would trump up this war hysteria to try and distract from what's been a really tough first year for this Democrat administration. I want to tell you, though, the reality is that this crisis has been playing out a lot longer than the Biden administration. This was something that really bothered Donald Trump's administration. It was there in the Obama era. Remember in 2014, the Russians actually did a soft invasion of Ukraine and annexed a chunk of Ukrainian territory, the
Sure.
Crimean Peninsula. So the idea that somehow Joe Biden has sat around in the White House basement and cooked up this scandal is a little bit ridiculous. I do think it's important that Americans wake up to the debate about why do we care about what's going on with an obscure former Soviet border. What we have to realize is that the government in Russia at this moment really does not stand for democratic or freedom, plurality, political plurality. You could be thrown in jail, and we have example after example of the Russian government having this authoritarian power grab going on in the last 10 years, especially as Putin has prepared to be this sort of czar, president for life, where political opposition doesn't really exist. If you rise up as political opposition, you could get poisoned, literally poisoned by Russian intelligence, or you could end up in jail, which is what happened with Alexei Navalny, this big case leading up to this. You could be jailed for your sexuality. You could be jailed for your religious beliefs. There's a case going on right now with Jehovah's Witnesses jailed by the Russians. The Washington Times actually has a story up about the State Department commenting in the background and condemning Russia's moves against religious groups that don't fit with what the Kremlin wants. So the idea here is that the government in Russia represents a sort of totalitarian, authoritarian style of government, and that the United States and democracies in Western Europe that want free markets and agreements of peaceful security arrangements are trying to push back from the possibility that Russia could go and just roll its army all over the place and absorb former Soviet republics. The final piece of this that's really important, I think, for people just learning about Ukraine is that what Russia does sets a precedent for other powers in the world. And the U.S. Government and intelligence community and Pentagon and Army and military have been quietly arguing for the past several years that we're entering an era of great power competition in the human species where the other great power is really China. And if Russia sets an example that it can roll in and take countries when it wants, how will China see that? And will that provide Beijing with a chance to say, well, the Russians did it, so we can sweep in and take Taiwan now. We can really do whatever we want. And America and its allies or partners just aren't going to stop it.
So it's kind of about the implications that it has in other areas, like you mentioned there, Taiwan, but you're also kind of hearkening back here to what we call the Reagan Doctrine, peace through strength, something like that.
Absolutely, but it's important that we have a healthy debate, and we look at this and determine whether it's in the U.S. Vital interests or the U.S. National interest to be involved in these situations. And there are going to be people. It's interesting right now where you've got people on the libertarian right who are aligned with people on the anti-war left. I mean, it's almost as if you could see Tucker Carlson getting in bed with Code Pink at this point, because Code Pink is holding a protest in front of the White House today, an anti-war protest, and Tucker Carlson is running segments on his show about how the U.S. should not have anything to do with Ukraine. It should be partnering with Russia. Why are we even considering backing Ukraine in some military standoff with Russia?
Yeah, and I think critics there would point out that it's not like Ukraine is some, perfect actor either here. I mean, it's
absolutely
Eastern European country with some of the highest rates of corruption. It's essentially an oligarchy. There's a lot of problems there too.
We saw that corruption was directly linked to American politics and the Democratic Party's attempt to actually impeachment of the former President Donald Trump. We also see the allegations of corruption over the current president's son. So in Ukraine, Hunter Biden. So you have this situation where Ukraine is not a model democracy. It's a fledgling democracy. And this is it's a difficult moment. And when you have brinkmanship, and this is another interesting piece of the whole foreign policy landscape, is it normally plays along without many people paying attention.
And you said suddenly brinkmanship?
Brinkmanship.
Can you explain that?
That's when you have nuclear powers who are arguing angrily suddenly over something like territorial lines and where armies can go. And that's where we are right now with Moscow. And we haven't had this level of brinkmanship since 2014. You're going to see lots of headlines today, this week, yesterday, tomorrow about how this is the biggest standoff since World War II, et cetera, et cetera. But really what we're seeing is a moment of brinkmanship between Moscow and Washington, as well as with Brussels and NATO. The Germans are involved because they're big recipients of Russian gas flowing in, and where do they stand on this? And the question is, can this brinkmanship be resolved diplomatically, or is it going to escalate into some kind of major move that could redraw some borders in the former Soviet republics? And really, that's a debate that's playing out right now. It's playing out in Washington. You're going to see it all over the place. And people on Capitol Hill are starting to take a side. In both parties, it's not just Democrats who are disagreeing with Republicans. Brinkmanship situations like this tend to bring about odd bedfellows. That was my point about Tucker Carlson, is that not everybody in the Republican parties agrees about what to do here, and not everybody in the Democratic Party agrees about what to do. It's a live debate, and the question is American democracy capable of making a policy that's actually going to be good for the world here and good for Americans?
Mm-hmm. What do you kind of see the end result being here? Really more in terms of what's Biden going to do about this?
Well, to harken back to your question of is Biden prepared to use U.S. troops, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, I think that Biden is getting a slate of advice from the National Security Council and then from civil society and former diplomats and whatnot in the region, intelligence, where he's being told, look, this could be an opportunity to strengthen the alliance with fledgling democracies in that part of the world, and that's good for the United States because it keeps U.S. markets, relationships with these countries strong, and strategically puts the United States in a position where it has friends in a very difficult neighborhood, which is Central Asia and really around Russia and right on the doorstep of China. So this is a chance for him to maybe send a few thousand American troops that aren't necessarily going to be jumping into trench warfare, but it's more of a symbolic move, whether it be to Poland or Latvia or Lithuania. The other possibility is he's being advised, look, Mr. President, if you want to win over the middle in this country going into the midterms, and you want to win some Republicans who might be frustrated with this sort of, adherence to Trumpian excitement, and actually you want to win them over by kind of giving a nod to America first, then you should be very careful here. This is an opportunity for you to possibly say we don't want to get enveloped into this kind of forever war. So there's a difficult situation for the Biden administration. And the last point on this is the administration in its first year, whether you support Biden or not, it's been very difficult from a foreign policy standpoint. The United States, the administration really struggled with its Iran policy. If Afghanistan pull out, I mean, there are going to people who cheer. There will be people who cheer that the U.S. finally got out of Afghanistan, but it was very messy, and it didn't help Biden politically. So here he's now confronted with another foreign policy crisis. This idea that he's made it up himself or not, it's a difficult one, and it could blow up in his face and make his presidency look really bad. So it's worth paying attention to, and we're going to see how it plays out here. Hopefully a lot of people aren't killed in an unnecessary conflict because of a Russian invasion.
Mm-hmm. It seems like just a lot of foreign policy missteps that Biden made in the past year are kind of making this, an even harder issue to grasp with. But Guy, thanks for coming on. Great to talk with you as always.
I'm always glad to be here, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.